Okay, we're in and back with another build video. For the Elder Scrolls Online. So in the recent events, actually I guess it's been about a month or so, it's been a bit since I've been in here, but recent events I managed to level my Nightblade. So I had a chance to kind of take a look at the Nightblade as a class, and overall with the new gear and new equipment, what I could do with it. This isn't the latest equipment, this is from the last round, I'd say High Isle. As far as the equipment being used, so it's not the latest and greatest. But this is another 1-bar build for the Nightblade, specifically for tanking. So, to get right into it, it's similar to the other builds that I've used in the past, so anybody that's tanked in this game for a decent amount of time realizes that a lot of the classes will become somewhat magicka dependent for your tanking skills, depending on what you're using. And in the theme of the stamina sork setup, where they can use Dark Deal to exchange for stamina, essentially the main key to this is essentially spell symmetry. This comes from the Mages Guild. It's the last thing to unlock. And essentially what this is doing is trading health for magicka. So this works the same way as Dark Deal does on the Sork, where you can exchange magicka for stamina or stamina for magicka, depending on what you're going for in the build, what you require. So this is kind of a key piece to all of the 1-bar tanking builds that I'm putting together, because this allows them to exchange a chunk of health to get magicka back, excuse me, which then can be used for your other skills. So the Nightblade actually has a decent amount of skills that can be used. So in some cases, these areas like the CC here are flexible as far as what you can place in here. I'm running, it's a 1-bar build, so of course you only have one weapon. I'm running, in this case, an ice staff, similar to the other tanking builds. And the main advantage that you get with the ice staff is it gives you the ability to block using magicka instead of the normal stamina cost. Going back to the skills here, so on the destruction staff, this isn't even fully leveled up, or wasn't. You can take the Trifocus passive here. It says while an ice staff is equipped, blocking costs magicka instead of stamina. So you'd want to put points into this passive. For a lot of people that run this, they don't necessarily want to do that, but for this particular build, you're going to want to put points into this, because the idea is to block using magicka and then exchange health for magicka to replenish the magicka. So what this ends up giving you is essentially almost a permablock build when you play it correctly. Now for the Nightblade actually, they made an adjustment a few patches ago to Dark Cloak, which has been kind of the tanking morph for a while now. They made some changes to it to where you now have to stand still, but which is not necessarily 100% ideal for tanking, but for the most part still works in terms of tanking versus someone who's trying to use this for a DPS where you're constantly moving around. Tanks at least have the ability to be a little more stationary than a DPS or a healer type setup. So this actually still works quite well, and the heal that you get from this is quite powerful. The old 8-second duration again was nicer, It's now 5 seconds. That was another thing that was adjusted multiple patches ago, but it actually still works quite well as a tank heal, and especially if it crits, you're actually getting a good amount of healing from this. And this is actually a heal over time. It's only 5 seconds, but it's still a heal over time versus like a burst heal that you would get from a warden, for example. So this is kind of key to, excuse me, the survival aspect. Nightblade actually is quite survivable versus some of the other classes. It's a little harder to pull off, but this is part of that survivability. So this is definitely one of the ones that you want to keep in terms of the skills on the bar. CC, I'm using Mass Hysteria. This is from the Nightblade skill line itself. It's a shadow skill. The CC is nice. It also applies Major Cowardice, which, you know, obviously reduces the damage that the mobs are going to be doing. So this is a nice skill to use. However, if you want to replace it, you can easily replace it with other skills in the game. Destruction Staff, using Wall of Elements, like Elemental Blockade, would be another good option here, because that's going to give shields for your team, as well as CC for the mobs. So this is kind of a flex spot. Generally speaking, I want some form of CC here. If for some reason you're running a setup that allows you to have a little more stam use, you could potentially run Fighter's Guild. You could run Circle of Protection using the Turn Evil Morph, which gives you a CC. So there are other options to put here, but generally speaking, what I'm going for is some sort of a crowd control ability here. So flexible there. Frost Clench is kind of a mandatory in terms of tanking. This is going to be your taunt. The nice thing about one bar gives you kind of a condensed bar to work with. Obviously you don't have a back bar with extra abilities, but the nice thing about Frost Clench is it gives you a full range taunt built in without having to worry about, typically on a 2-bar tank, I'm running the one-handed shield, or basically I've got Pierce Armor or Ransack, depending on what you want to do. So this is the front bar taunt, and then on the back bar, I would typically run Inner Rage, Inner Beast, again, depending on whether you have more mag or stam. And you end up basically running 2 taunts. The reason being that this gives you the range taunt, whereas the one-handed shield, Ransack, is a close range taunt. So you end up having to run both, because there are some mobs that you're going to want to taunt from afar, or bosses that you're going to want to taunt, and you're not going to be able to run to everything. So you need a range taunt. The nice thing about this skill is it is the same range, 28 meters for this as well as this. And it gives you the Major Maim built in addition. So I like this one. You're already running a Destruction Staff, so this is available to you. Or if you prefer Inner Fire, Inner Beast, this is another good option as far as a taunt. Spell Symmetry, we already talked about. This is basically going to be your health from Magicka exchange. This is going to allow you to effectively permablock, give you a nice amount of Magicka back, and we've got between the, well, I'll go over into the details. Basically, we have a nice big health pool to pull from, so this is actually, it's not an issue in terms of survivability or making you overly vulnerable. And then lastly, I'm running Silver Leash. This is another flex spot. It kind of depends on your play style. I like the ability to be able to actively pull in mobs. I think it helps the team to kind of bring everything together into kind of a condensed cluster so that you can AoE things down much more quickly. So this is my preference. I think it actually works quite well. This comes from the Fighters Guild skill line. It's actually the first one to unlock. And you want the Silver Leash morph because that's the one that actually pulls enemies in. But it's another flex spot. If you, depending on what you put into this slot, maybe this isn't a CC ability, maybe you want something different here, in which case you can use different things to be able to manage mobs and bosses however you see fit. But I like CC and being able to pull mobs, so those are the two options that I go with. The ultimate is also somewhat flexible here. Nightblade actually has two pretty decent ultimates. I don't recommend going with either of the Morphs under Assassination, just because it's not really a tanking capability, but both Shadow and Siphoning offer some good options as far as tanking goes. Under the Shadow scale line, Bolstering Darkness is generally the one that you would choose for tanking. It gives major protection and gives healing for your group. Siphoning also, if you go with the Soul Siphon versus Soul Tether, which is more the DPS morph, going with Soul Siphon also offers some decent benefits to the group. So either one of these are fine. However, this is really flexible. I don't know that I would recommend going with the Destruction Staff, because again, that's more of a DPS thing, but you could potentially, if you wanted to. You've got an Ice Staff, so you've got some benefits that would come from that. Let's see, what else would we have? On odd occasions, I have actually seen people run the Soul Magic. Dawnbreaker, you could run this. Again, this is more of a DPS option, but potentially you could run Meteor. So it's not generally the tank's job to be augmenting DPS by large amounts, but it's kind of comes down to the flavor of how you want to run a tank. So completely optional. I usually just go with things that are more beneficial from either a healing or a damage reduction standpoint to the team. So that's basically it for skills. You've got 2 flex spots. Ultimate is somewhat flexible as well. The healing is kind of mandatory, and of course the taunt is something that's mandatory. You have other options for the taunt, but given the options between a close and range taunt, I would definitely take the range. And then spell symmetry is kind of a requirement for the build as well. As far as gear, if you've seen my other videos, you know I'm a big fan of leeching. So leeching is kind of my core set for tanking. I think it brings a lot of survivability. It's probably, in my opinion, the best tanking setup for survivability in the game. And for those that may look at this and say, well, that's from a crutch standpoint or that type of thing, I look at it as a tank's job is to survive. And if I'm not having to worry as much about my own survival, that means I can be more helpful to the team, offering buffs, debuffs, whatever it may be. So this essentially gives me good survivability, which allows me to focus more on the task at hand, which is helping my team and ultimately completing whatever the dungeon is that we're running. So I like leeching. That's my main set. Secondary set in this case. So right now I'm running an Ice Staff of leeching. I've got the defending trait on here. Defending is a good option if you're on a class, or excuse me, a race like Nord already has some additional defensive capabilities, so maybe you want to alter defending for something else. But that's just the trait that I choose. So I've got necklace, ring. This is an Oakensoul build. This is a 1-bar build. Most of my tanking builds are using Oakensoul. This is a mythic item, obviously. I like this for tanking. Oakensoul did get a significant nerf from when it was initially released, but I think it still works exceptionally well for tanking and even some DPS setups. I still run this on a few builds. I still like Oakensoul. It may not be best in slot in terms of maximum DPS, but generally speaking, my builds are... I'll go through and I'll run through and I'll do testing and I'll try to optimize based on the gear that's available, but ultimately, as most of you know, once you get into the harder content, these guys that are doing DPS testing on the dummies, with the exception of a small percentage, you're not getting anywhere near those numbers because you're you're having to move too much, you're blocking, you're dodging, any number of things. So I don't look at the top numbers as being kind of my goal. My goal is survivability first and foremost, and then how can I augment the team? How can I offer damage or whatever it is that I'm here to do? So if you're dead, you're no good to anybody. In fact, you're a burden. So Oaken Soul is just set up to be very nicely balanced, especially for a tank where those top numbers aren't as critical. So and it makes for a really nice setup for one bar builds. So Oaken Soul. So I've got a necklace and ring of leeching. These are both infused. This is another piece of the builds that I've been putting together that's a little more critical. I'm running infused on all the jewelry. So obviously you're going to have to trait change the leeching because they come with healthy by default. But the reason that I'm running infused is because I'm running block cost reduction on all 3 pieces. This is another aspect to the kind of perma block setup that's kind of critical. So you are going to need transmute stones, but nowadays those are much easier to get. So all infused, block cost reduction on here, combined with the ability to trade health for magicka here, means that I can essentially pull this and just keep exchanging one for the other. So it works very, very well. The one thing you have to keep in mind is spell symmetry is it's something that when you're casting it, because it has a cast time, you're not technically blocking. So you can be interrupted during that time. It indicates that the block is still there, but essentially you can be interrupted in the middle of that. So be aware you want to cast that when it's not a big heavy coming or something like that. So so leeching on one side. In this case, my secondary set, I actually I like doing kind of fun factors, adding either visual effects or kind of bringing in secondary sets that offer something that's a little more interesting rather than just has to be meta. And in this case, I've been wanting to run, the Grace of Gloom set for quite a while now, and I hesitated because it's not the greatest in terms of what it has to offer. There are any number of sets that are going to outperform this or maybe offer more. So take this with a grain of salt. Secondary set is flexible in this sense. If you want to run something else, that's completely up to you. I went with this just because it fits the Nightblade theme. The visual effects are pretty cool that you get from this, and ultimately it's not a bad set in terms of tanking. It's not terrible. And anybody that's played Skyrim, of course, remembers the Ebony set. So it's a fun set to run. It has a cool visual effect, and I was looking for an excuse to run it. So running something like this on a tank, again, tanks are less critical in terms of what they have to be able to reach peak numbers, that kind of thing. So it's a little more flexible, and I thought this would be a fun set to run. So you'll notice that I don't have a monster set, and that actually gives me the ability to bring in both a mythic as well as, in this case, let's see, where are you? Here we go. So I went with Greaves in this case. Trainee stuff can be crafted. There's a number of trainee items. If you look up under UESP, the website, there's a number of things where it goes through the different quests that offer specific named trainee drops. So there are any number of things that you can usually pick up on the guild stores pretty cheaply, or you can go out and do the quests yourself to get pieces of trainee. But essentially, I'm running one piece of trainee because the stats that it gives you are just almost too good to pass up for a one piece, and that combined with the mythic item here, essentially that takes up the 2 slots that I would normally have for the monster helm. So this, I guess, technically is optional, but I from a survivability standpoint, If you're not running Oakensole, I think you would probably have to make some major adjustments to the build, and if you're not running Oakensole at that point, then you can really move from a 1 bar back to a 2 bar, so it really does change things fundamentally if you're not going to go with Oakensole. So for this build, I would say this is a core piece of it. I'm running Sturdy on everything, again, to kind of maximize that reduction in cost for the blocking. This allows you to block even more than normally as far as holding the block, and it costs less and less, so that's essentially it. So Sturdy, everything with health. These two sets are both heavy. If you do alter the secondary set with something else other than going with leeching, you would have to keep in mind that obviously ideally you'd want heavy, so you're getting all heavy pieces, but again, it's a little flexible if you wanted to put something else on. If you're running something that's a light or a medium set, I would recommend running the last piece here on the belt and then replacing the jewelry. So we'd swap your medium light set jewelry in here. So you'd have to do some alterations, but generally speaking, it's easiest just to go with heavy sets. So that's the gear, the skills, passives, pretty straightforward. Again, this was a character I was leveling, that's why some of this stuff isn't locked in, but generally speaking, I try to take all the passives and unlock things as quickly as I can, so all your class passives, destruction staff passives, you'd want everything here. Armor, you're completely in heavy armor in this setup, so the only thing that you would need are these passives. You don't need any of the medium or the light. Let's see, guild. There's a few under Fighters Guild that you can take as far as ultimate generation, but these are probably less critical. Mages Guild, I take most of these, depending on what they are, that some of them may not be required, but it helps to reduce the cost here, as well as give you some additional capabilities from having this slotted. And then, let's see, Undaunted. If you can get them, Undaunted is definitely going to help you. In this case, I'm only wearing heavy armor, so the Undaunted metal is only giving me a 2% bonus. If you did have a setup where your secondary set was a light or a medium setup, you could potentially get a little bit more bonus from this. But generally speaking, Undaunted is something that you'd want. We're not currently... Oh, actually, Aggressive Horn would be another option for your ultimate down here too. This is a nice option to have for tanking. We're not using any of those abilities, so... And then, of course, your racials. In my case, I'm a Dark Elf. This is not necessarily optimal for tanking. In the past, a lot of my builds I've gone with Imperial or Nord, just because they tend to be more suited towards tanking with the heavy amounts of health and stamina, or resistance, or ultimate generation, whatever it may come with. This was I knew I would be using this for DPS as well, so I ended up going with Dark Elf just because I wanted a bit more of a balance with the race. Dark Elf actually does bring, it doesn't bring any health, but it does bring the magic and stamina, both of which are handy on a tank. So it's still a decent choice, but really the race is fully flexible here. There's no requirement in terms of the build that says you have to run any particular race. The more health you have, generally speaking, the less you have to worry about symmetry being a problem. But because we're running all heavy, with the benefits that the heavy armor gives you, plus we're running... excuse me, I didn't want to do that. You're running all healthy with health traits here. In this case, we are losing the healthy trait on the jewelry, so there is a little bit less than you would normally have, but again, we're going for that kind of perma-block setup. Within the CP, green tree, it doesn't matter, it's completely up to you. these are the options that I typically run. I like a little bit additional movement speed when you're out of combat. Just kind of helps you get to things more quickly. This is going to increase your food. We are running food. We're running sugar skulls, so this is actually going to benefit, just save us a little bit in terms of the food. Treasure chest quality, I normally take this for any class that's going to be running dungeons, because this is going to increase what I get from the chests. And then the rest is completely optional. And even this, most of this stuff is really optional. It's up to you what you prefer to take. So green tree is less critical. Here I normally take unassailable, enduring resolve, duelist or buff, and then within here, ironclad. All of these are good in terms of reducing the damage you're going to take. So when you get the points, you're definitely going to want to put points into there. And then beyond that, I basically just kind of start splitting off into the various areas. So you can get more stamina, more magicka, put points into this one, which then gives me additional healing from over here. And then over here, I'm basically going for magicka status effects. But these are less critical. The critical ones are the ones that are currently being used in the active slots. And then for the red tree, I do take health, especially in this case because the dark elves don't have health by default, or they don't have the health benefit. So I definitely take health. That helps to boost that. Down here, I also put points into health to give me a little bit more. It's not a huge amount, but it's every little bit helps. Again, this is a little flexible. I like cost reduction when it comes to the skills. And being a tank, you're going to be afflicted with status effects a lot. So I think this is, generally speaking, a good one to take because it's reducing by a significant amount. So that helps reduce the cost. When you have the points, putting points into roll dodge, break free, sprinting reduction, cost reduction, that's also helpful. These two, especially break free and roll dodge. And I have health recovery on this one. This one, again, it's not a requirement. It just helps if you have an ultimate that isn't necessarily being used constantly. This will allow you to keep a little bit more health recovery, which of course helps you stay alive a little bit better. And then, excuse me, over here, 6 points into Nimble Protector. And then this is just 20% block mitigation. It's hard to beat this. So this would definitely be a one that I would take probably first and foremost. This is only here essentially to unlock this, because in our case our blocks actually don't cost stamina. I don't know why Zos hasn't altered this or set it up to where it does stamina and magicka, because this is very specifically the damage block. This is a good one to take, but this one is specific to stamina. There's no indication here that if you switch over to magicka that this will work to your benefit. So I've never actually tested it. It's possible it does, but based on the wording, it looks like it's stamina only. So hopefully they'll update that with some of the other hybrid changes. And then looks like it got 16 points. This isn't required. This is just, I'm just spending points because I've got extra points and nowhere to put them. So I think that kind of rounds it out. So that's CP. Like I said, I'm using Sugar Schools for the food. These are all the buffs that you're getting from Oaken Soul and the Lord in this case. So I'm boosting the health. You can run this on really any of the races, because more health is always going to benefit you. A lot of the tanks you'll see will run mag recovery. They'll run the Atronak. In this particular instance, I wouldn't recommend running that, just because you're going to be, it's more of a perma-block build and your blocking is costing magicka. So as soon as you're in block mode, your recovery is going to be 0. So it doesn't do any good to run that particular Mundus. So because of that, and because it's a dark elf, in this case I went with the Lord, just gives me that much more health. It kind of compensates. And then all points into health here as well. You can see our end stats. We've got a decent pool of magicka and stam, and just under 52,000 basically for your health, which is more than enough to do any of the content in the game. So, and you notice our health recovery is sitting at 2830, and that's because of the CP point. So that's it. I think I covered everything. This has been run on Vet DLC dungeons with no issues. Works very, very well. I don't typically, most of the tanks that I build, I don't think I build anything with the intent of anything lower than a Vet DLC type content. I don't typically run trials, so that may be a different story where maybe you'd want to run a completely different setup. I'm not sure, but for Vet DLC content, dungeons and below, this should work very, very well. It's being a 1-bar buildup, it's easy to play. You're essentially looking at a permablock setup. So I like it. I'm actually enjoying the 1-bar builds, 1-bar tanking especially. So hopefully you'll get something out of it. And if you have any comments or feedback, or want to let me know how it goes, feel free. Thanks for watching.